This has been some kind of week. Aside from going in for surgery. You know, I know I'm looking forward to getting out of pain, but I'm really looking forward to someday being with Jesus in glory and not having these issues. But aside from the surgery and everything that's coming up, for that end of it, for me, this has been kind of a week. I got a call from my brother this week, and he told me that my sister, who lives in Redding, California, had her home burned down. There's a big fire up there, huge one. And the fire came raging through like a fire tornado. They have a name for that, of some sort. And apparently she had been evacuated 3 times in 36 hours, and the 3rd time was the final one, okay, is what I've been told. And burned everything down, because we saw pictures afterwards where a fireman was able, who was a friend, was able to take pictures of her lot. And that's what it is. It's a driveway lot now. And it's all gone. She has 3 kids who live up there. And the oldest one, we thought his place burned down, he and his wife. But we found out that his is the only house that's standing on his street. The rest of them are all burned down. And then my other niece and nephew, they're okay. They've evacuated from time to time and come back. So it's you know, that kind of devastation's happening. And we also got word from our friends Calvin and Vicky right here. They have missionary friends, and the wife collapsed. And can you tell me what exactly it was?
So it was ironic, because I was literally on the phone with them, praying over the phone with them. And right in the middle of the prayer, the husband said that the wife is not feeling, she's on the floor. And she had a massive aneurysm. And she's 58 years old. And anyway, so they did a brain operation to try to fix the aneurysm. And she survived that, but she still has bleeding in the brain. So there's really no hope for her. So yesterday they took her off of all artificial type of support. So she's slowly deteriorating. So right now we're just praying for a miracle for her.
Yeah, so she's just on palliative care, and that doesn't look good. So we live in this fallen world. We know it. And we think, you know, things are okay until they're not. And then these various events and things happen to us. And, you know, it's just life lessons. And we have this life lesson here in the book of Ruth that we're going to be talking about. And so I get to introduce this today, that we're going to be talking about the book of Ruth. And as a matter of fact, you can open up your Bibles to the book of Ruth. And Ruth is in the Old Testament. It's right after Judges. It comes after the books of the law, the 5 books of law and Judges. And then we have Ruth, and there's, yes?
I just want to say, I feel compelled to say something. I'm Lori Della Cruz, and I had a blood vessel break in my brain in, I think it was April. And prayer of this group, this church, I had a miracle. So I just want to testify that prayer does work, and I'm grateful for everything that we pray.
And I'll let the husband know that.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And
what's her name?
Yeah. Her name is Gay.
Can we just pray for her now? Yeah.
Gay, yeah. You know, that would be a good thing to go ahead and lift Gay up, and her husband's name's Lionel?
Lionel.
Lionel. So let me do that right now and pray for them. God, you are just awesome and great God, and you're able to do just incredible things. We know we live in this fallen world, and but yet you're able to save, you're able to rescue, you're able to help, you're able to do all these things. And we want to pray for Lionel and Gay. They're missionaries out in the mission field, and for this to happen, and it just shakes up the world for that family, and for that to happen. We don't know what you had in store, what you're going to do, how you're going to do it, but we lift it up to you. I pray for Lionel and just his faith and the questioning that is going through his mind right now, that you give him the confidence of faith. I pray that if it's in your will to heal Gay, that you can do that as you've done Lori. And I just give it into your hands, and because you are a God who is able to accomplish all more and abundantly more than what we even ask and pray for. So we pray these things in Christ's name. Amen. Okay, so back to Ruth. If you open up the book of Ruth. Ruth, one of the reasons why they put it next to Judges is because it occurred during the time of the Judges. Okay? Is that sort of thing. If you had a Hebrew Bible, you were Jewish and you had a Hebrew Bible, you'd see Ruth in the writings and not placed where it is in our Bible today. But in our Bible, it's next to Judges because it occurred during the times of the Judges. And so we see right from the very beginning in Ruth 1, chapter 1, verse 1, it says, in the days when the judges ruled. So that gives us the indication, well, Judges was happening and that sort of thing. And so I just want to talk about just the settings about this and the background and the purpose of why we have this book of Ruth. Certainly the characters. There's a few characters to talk about, and there's some themes. Okay, so we want to set this up for you so that when we go through each of these chapters, you have this background information as to, that's what was happening. Okay, that's what was taking place, and so it helps us, I think, to understand this. So here, Israel surrounded by various countries. It was during the times of the Judges. It says in verse 1, there was a famine in the land, and a man in Bethlehem in Judah went to sojourn in the country of Moab, he and his wife and his 2 sons. So, who are the judges? And so if you don't know who the judges were like rulers or governors or leaders. That's how we would say them. So they weren't like judges today who sit on the bench and rule on court cases. No, these were guys who would lead and rule and go out to battle. And then they would also pronounce judgment, certainly. They would do that. And to give us a better idea, I kind of want to take a look at Judges so that you see what was happening there. And kind of to start off, as a matter of fact, turn to Judges chapter 2. That's a good place for us to start here to give us a really good idea. In Judges chapter 2, Joshua was the servant to Moses. The people were coming out of Egypt into the promised land. Moses had died. Joshua was now given the assignment to go in and conquer the promised land. And so he begins to do that. And then he gets old. And so in Judges 2, verse 8, it says, Joshua, the son of Nun, the servant of the Lord, died at the age of 110. So he dies. And then in verse 10, it says, and all that generation, the generation of Joshua here, also were gathered to their fathers. They died. And there arose another generation after them who did not know the Lord or the work that he had done for Israel. Okay, so the people didn't know. And so what do these people do? Well, in verse 11, the people of Israel did what was evil in the sight of the Lord and served the Baals, and they abandoned the Lord, the God of their fathers, who had brought them out of the land of Egypt. They were unfaithful to God. That's what was happening here. And it says here they went after other gods from among the gods of the peoples who were among them from the surrounding nations, even though God instructed them not to. And it says they went after other gods from among gods, and they bowed down to them, and they provoked the Lord to anger. is what it says. And so what does God do? They abandoned the Lord and served the Baals and the Ashtaroth. That's the idol worship. So the anger of the Lord was kindled against Israel, and he gave them over to plunderers who plundered them, and he sold them into the hand of their surrounding enemies so that they could no longer withstand their enemies. Whenever they marched out, the hand of the Lord was against them for harm, as the Lord had warned, and as the Lord had sworn to them, and they were in terrible distress. So this was the situation. So the people cry out to God, and then God hears them. So here in verse 16, it says, "Then the Lord raised up judges who saved them out of the hand of those who plundered them." And so I'm thinking, well, then they learned their lesson, right? Well, wouldn't they? They should. Well, would you, if this happened to you? And so in verse 18, whenever the Lord raised up judges for them, the Lord was with the judge, and he saved them from the hand of their enemies all the days of the judge. For the Lord was moved to pity by their groaning because of those who afflicted and oppressed them. But whenever the judge died, they turned back and were more corrupt than their fathers, going after other gods, serving them and bowing down to them. They did not drop any of their practices or their stubborn ways. Okay? So that's what was happening here. Okay? And, it said that the Israelites had heads of iron. They were stubborn. Okay? They're obstinate people. And so they're obstinate in that they would go after and serve other gods, follow after what other countries were doing, and then they get into this problem, and then they would be taken into captivity again. And so this pattern continued for over 200 years, 200 to 400 years of this repeating pattern. So I think there's in the neighborhood of about 12 judges in the book of Judges. In other words, God would hear their cry, raise up a judge, and then the judge would rescue them. They'd come back to Israel, and then they would fall into this pattern again after the judge died. And so this pattern continued on. For example, I'll just read you this in Judges chapter 3. This right back into it. "And the people of Israel did what was evil in the sight of the Lord. They forgot the Lord their God and served the Baals and the Ashtaroth. Therefore the anger of the Lord was kindled against Israel, and he sold them into the hand of Cushan the Rishathaim, king of Mesopotamia," which is somewhere next to Baghdad in Iraq today. "And the people of Israel served Cushan Rishathaim 8 years. But when the people of Israel cried out to the Lord raised up a deliverer from the people of Israel, who saved them, Othniel, the son of Kenaz, Caleb's younger brother." So this was the repeating pattern. And that judge would free them, then the judge would die, and that people would go back to doing what they were doing. Do you see all that? All these things that are happening? And they would go back to worshiping idols. They would go back to doing everything that they wanted to do. So there is a verse here, okay? And the verse is in Judges 17:6. It says, "In those days there was no king in Israel. Everyone did what was right in his own eyes." That kind of sums up what was happening.
Then or now? Oh, sorry.
You hit it right on, Andy. Andy said then or now. That's exactly what's happening today. Do you see that? So we don't exactly have a king. We have a president in this country, and there are prime ministers and kings in other countries, right? But it's very true. Everyone is doing what was right in their own eyes. Now, do we have laws in this country? Yes, we do. Did the Israelites, were they given laws? Yes, they were. But they did evil continually, and we're doing the same thing. Do you see that? That's what's happening. So it's the same thing that's happening to us today, and that's why this is very appropriate to talk about this. So in the midst of this Judges, we have this story of Ruth. Okay? And so it is just a huge contrast. But you need to have this background. What's been happening, what's going on. Ruth is a love story, but it's way more than that. It's a story of devotion, a story of redemption in the midst of what was happening in Judges, what you just saw. Okay? And I think the context of Judges kind of helps us to understand this. So for instance, back to Ruth chapter 1, verse 1, where we said, the day the judges ruled, there was a famine in the land. Well, why was there a famine in the land of Israel? Why? God had judged Israel. In other words, there's consequences for acting evil in our sin? You bet. That's exactly what that is. And so there's a famine in the land, and that family moves away from their hometown seeking a better living, a better life, seeking food, the basics, and that sort of thing. And so what does the family do? Well, the family moves to Moab. Well, where's Moab, and what's Moab about? Okay? And so just a little bit of background in terms of Moab. Moab basically comes from, in the Old Testament, from Genesis chapter 19 and verse 37. Okay? And in chapter 19, 37, we have the story of Lot. Lot had escaped Sodom. His wife didn't. What happened to his wife? Anybody know? Pillar of salt. Okay? But he escaped with his daughters. I think his son-in-laws didn't. And he goes up to the hill country out of Zoar, which is in the hills of Moab. Okay, and then what happens is his daughters become pregnant by him and have children. So in verse 37, Genesis 19:37, it says the firstborn, that is Lot's firstborn daughter, bore a son and called his name Moab. He is the father of Moabites to this day. So that's the beginning of Moab. That's the beginning of the Moabites, lived in Moab. And so, but what's the significance, okay, of Moab? Well, as Moses was coming out of Egypt, okay, one of the things that God told Moses, who related to the peoples here in Deuteronomy 2:9, he basically said, the Lord said, do not harass Moab or contend with them in battle. He said, for I will not give you any of their land for a possession, because I have given Ar to the people of Lot for a possession. So the Lord was still favoring Lot. Okay? And so that's in Deuteronomy 2:9. So he'd given the land to Lot and his descendants. But when Moses came up to the land of Moab, and the Israelites are journeying towards the promised land, kind of a curious thing happened. Not curious, but something happened in terms of these Moabites, and they refused to let the Israelites pass through their land. And they did not give them water or bread. They said, we don't want you here. We think you're going to take over. So, God had said to Moses, look, I'm favoring Lot and his descendants. I've given them that land, Moab. You're not to harass them. You're not to battle. You're not to live there. You're not to take it over. Okay? That's what God had said to Lot, to Moses. Okay? So now, as they're coming through and journeying on their journeying way to the promised land, the Moabites say, you can't come through our land. Okay? Because we've seen already what you did to the Ammonites and to Og and Sihon, kings of the Ammonites, and you destroyed them because they wouldn't let you in their land. So, and the story is told here in Numbers chapter 22, and so they refused to him. So Numbers chapter 22, starting in verse 1, okay, and going to verse 6, it says here, the people of Israel set out and camped in the plains of Moab, beyond the Jordan at Jericho, and Balak, the son of Zippor, saw all that Israel had done to the Amorites. Okay? And Moab was in great dread of the people that Israel had done to the Amorites. And Moab was in great dread of the people because they were many. Moab was overcome with fear of the people of Israel. And Moab said to the elders of Midian, this horde will now lick up all that is around us, as the ox licks up the grass of the field. So Balak, the son of Zippor, who was king of Moab at the time, sent messengers to Balaam, the son of Beor at Pethor, who is near the river in the land of the people of Awah, to call him, saying, behold, a people has come out of Egypt. They cover the face of the earth. There might have been over 1 million people, just so you know. And they were dwelling opposite me. Come now, curse this people for me, since they are too mighty for me. Perhaps I shall be able to defeat them and drive them from the land, for I know that he whom you bless is blessed, and he whom you curse is cursed. Well, this is exactly precisely the time the Israelites could have used their help on their journey when he's saying this. And as the story goes, the Moabites hired Balaam to try to curse Israel. But God wanted nothing to do with that. As a matter of fact, he turned the tables totally against him. He had different plans. That comes from Genesis chapter 12, by the way. When God said to Abraham, he basically said to Abraham, him who dishonors you, I will curse. So God is saying to Abraham, if somebody dishonors you, I will curse them. This is now coming true. Okay? And so we'll go down to Numbers 24. Okay? And Balaam ends up blessing Israel. It says he took up his discourse and said, this is the final discourse, he said, the oracle of Balaam, the son of Beor, the oracle of the man whose eye is opened, the oracle of him who hears the words of God and knows the knowledge of the Most High, who sees the vision of the Almighty, falling down with his eyes uncovered, I see him, but not now. I behold him, but not near. A star shall come out of Jacob, and a scepter, like a scepter that a king would have, shall rise out of Israel. By the way, just so you know, that just as a side, the scepter rising out of Israel, that's Jesus Christ, the King, right there. Okay? It shall crush the forehead of Moab. In other words, God wasn't going to let the Israelites be cursed because his king was going to rise out of Israel. Do you see this? It's going to happen. And break down all the sons of Sheth. Edom shall be dispossessed. Seir also, his enemies shall be dispossessed. Israel is doing valiantly, and one from Jacob shall exercise dominion and destroy the survivors of cities, and so on and so forth. So we see right there that God is turning this around completely. Instead of cursing the Israelites, Balaam is blessing them, okay? And that's exactly what happens. One more thing, I want to give you Deuteronomy 23. Oops. I don't have that. There's a maps. I've given you maps, but I'm going to come back to that. Here's Deuteronomy 23. Okay? I'll come back to the maps in a second here. Deuteronomy 23, 3 through 5. No Ammonite or Moabite may enter the assembly of the Lord. Is Deuteronomy 23. Even to the 10th generation, none of them may enter the assembly of the Lord forever, because they did not meet you with bread and with water on the way when you came out of Egypt, and because they hired against you Balaam, the son of Beor, from Pethor, Mesopotamia, to curse you. But the Lord your God would not listen to Balaam. Instead, the Lord your God turned the curse into a blessing for you, because the Lord your God loved you. Okay? So, that's the context. That's the setting here of Moab, and the setting that we have during the times of the judges. And here is the pictures of Moab, okay? And so the purple on the map on the left is where they think the kingdom of Moab is. Right now, it's that area is Jordan, the country of Jordan, right now. And the blue part right next to the purple is the Dead Sea. So on the left, on the right is the map, Moab and the Dead Sea. And where the characters of Ruth come out of is Bethlehem. It's towards the top in the middle. You see Bethlehem up there? That's where they came out of. And they probably went through Jericho and came down to Moab. And scholars think that this is what it would have looked like. So it wasn't a famine. There was green grass and food there, and it looked pretty nice. Okay? As to why they probably settled there in Moab. Okay? And so, worldly wise, humanly speaking, this looks a lot better than living in an area that has famine going on. Okay? But yet there's a bigger picture going on that they probably can't see and don't know. Okay? That we get the benefit of hindsight and looking back, that God had set it up this way. So here in the land of Moab, Moab is under Deuteronomy excluded, under Deuteronomy, they're excluded from worship, public worship. That's where it says here in Deuteronomy, none may enter the assembly of the Lord. And that's called the public worship, basically, of the Israelites, the Jews. And so Moab is being excluded from the congregation of Israel. God did not want the Israelites mixing with Moabites. Do you see what's happening here? So he had first favored it because of Lot. Okay? But then these events happened, and God is now saying, I don't want the Israelites mixing with the Moabites here. And that's not going to happen anymore. And by the way, after these things happened in Genesis, do you hear much of happening with Lot? Yeah, not much. As a matter of fact, I can't even tell you. Nothing's happened. And so all we're hearing about is about Moab. That was Lot's descendants, and it's telling us they're not allowed in the congregation of Israel. Okay? And we have another reference in Ezra. Okay? So Ezra is another book that comes right after Ruth. And Ezra was a scribe who was brought into captivity, and he comes back to Israel, and he finds a whole bunch of Israelites, guess what? Married to Moabites. And he condemns them. And he tells them God does not want them married to Moabites, okay? So if you were to read Ezra, you're going to find that type of thing. And so this is very curious to me, because here we have in the story of Ruth, Ruth is a Moabitess. And she marries into Naomi's family, who are Israelites from Bethlehem. Very clear. And yet, God has told the Israelites not to do this. Isn't this fascinating? So why is that? So I'm not going to spoil it for you, because I'm going to let my good friend Steve here tell you that next week. So come back next week and you're going to find out. Okay? All right?
Go ahead.
No. He's thinking, I didn't study that. So I'm not going to go ahead and spoil and talk about that part. But here, Ruth is a Moabitess. She's from Moab. And she marries Naomi's son, Mahlon. Okay? And so let's talk a little bit about Ruth here and the cast of characters and kind of the key verse here. And so Mahlon, by the way, his name means weekly, week. Okay? That's what his name is. Okay? So she marries this guy. Okay? And they were married, in Scripture it tells us they were married for 10 years, and then he dies. Okay? Well, first, First, Naomi's husband dies, and then Mahlon, I don't know if Mahlon dies first or his brother dies, but both of them die. And both of them are married Moabites, okay? And it tells us they were married for 10 years. He dies. And we don't know a whole lot necessarily other than, okay, this is what Scripture's telling us. But we have an indication of Ruth's disposition. Yes, okay, you want to interject?
I'm just amazed. Here's another example of parents naming their children these bizarre derogatory names.
Oh, you mean weekly?
Yeah, and then we had that other guy who was named Fool.
Yes, we did.
What's going
Yeah.
on? Is this the NFL or something, or what?
You know, the parents get to choose the names.
What?
So, do you know, for some reason, that's what they had decided. Now, remember, the son had grew up in Bethlehem, not in Moab. Okay? And the family moved out of Bethlehem to Moab. So you got that picture, right? Probably when he was younger and he wasn't married, and now he meets this Moabitess, Ruth, and he marries her. Okay? That's the situation. No kids, don't know why they named him that particular name. Okay? But we've got something else for you. Just hold on a second. Okay? Let's kind of take this in order. So as far as Ruth goes, we have an indication of her disposition after something like this happens. Now, a lot of tragedy going on in the world. So when things like, you know, a dear friend collapses on the floor and she has these medical problems which does not look good and she's about to die, and when death occurs, that's just tragic. It's just hard. And I can't imagine, it just is hard for anybody in your family to die, even when they're older. It's a difficult thing. Okay? Or somebody loses something, it's just hard. So here, Ruth loses her husband. Already her father-in-law had already died. And I can't imagine, people kind of go off the deep end when these things happen. We know this. Not everybody, some people do. But Ruth, it's given us Scripture's given us every indication she didn't. Okay? And so I know that because we see that verse that I have up there, you know, that verse 16. And this is really the key verse of probably the whole book. Ruth said, do not urge me to leave you. And she's saying this in response to Naomi, who said, you know, you got to go back to your own people because I'm going to leave here. I'm going to go back to Bethlehem, okay? She said, Ruth said back to her, do not urge me to leave you or to return from following you, for where you go, I will go, and where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, and your God, my God. That's just incredible to me, okay? We can take this and just go by this so quickly and not really think a whole lot about it. I know that there's a good, famous Christian song on this, okay? Right, exactly. But this is significant in terms of where Ruth was coming from. I mean, her husband had died, her father-in-law had died, and now her mother-in-law says, go back to your own people because I'm leaving. Yes?
I just want to add to it, there was no social aid in this society.
None.
The men were the workers. The men were the providers. So when you look at Naomi, she's lost her husband. She's lost, and then when that happened, the sons, having sons for a woman would be her security for her old age. She's lost her sons. So now she's got the responsibility of not knowing where she's going to have food and especially protection. And so now she's got a daughter-in-law that now she has a responsibility of trying to protect, and she wasn't protected. So when you start to look at that whole, where studying the scripture of then versus what we understand today, as a widow would have some social aid to be sheltered under, and a police force to protect her. There was nothing like that for her.
Right, nothing at all. Absolutely right on. And so it's hard to understand this, your people shall be my people, your God shall be my God. Wow. So she had that temperament to stick it out. She absolutely did. And I mean, she could have left as soon as her husband died. She didn't have children. Okay? And so It's like, wow, everything's just up in the air right now. But her faith had to have grown big time. And so that's what I take from her. You know, she had undoubtedly learned about the true one God, and she had learned that from this family and had come to know God, and God ends up extending grace to her. That's really what's happening here. And so that's what God does. He extends grace to those whom He knows, those who know Him. We've learned this. We've learned this. We're studying Ephesians, right? Pastor Bobby's preaching on Ephesians, and we've been through Ephesians chapter 2. And chapter 2, verses 11, 16, Paul talks about this grace here. He says, therefore remember that at one time you were Gentiles in the flesh, called the uncircumcision by what is called the circumcision. In other words, the Jews called us Gentiles as the uncircumcised, which is made in the flesh by hands. Remember that you were at that time separated from Christ, alienated from the commonwealth of Israel, and strangers to the covenants of promise, having no hope, and been brought near by without God in the world. But now in Christ Jesus, you who once were far off have been brought near by the blood of Christ. Okay? That's the same thing as happened here to Ruth. Okay? And she has been reconciled here, as it goes on to say in Ephesians here. And so this was Ruth, a Gentile. She's separated by God, but yet she's saved by God and brought back into fellowship. And she chooses to abandon her Moabite family, her homeland. Okay? That's what she's doing. And so she's demonstrating her love for Naomi. Okay? And she's demonstrating her faith in God by her doing this. Okay? So that's a little bit about Ruth and what was happening with Ruth. We have Naomi. Naomi, she's an older woman. She's past her childbearing years. She's lost her husband. I mean, the unthinkable happens. She loses her husband. Then her 2 sons die. So she had to be crushed by this loss. I just can't imagine it. Okay? Her name, Steve, means sweetness. Naomi means sweetness. Okay? So she decides to call herself bitter. So in this verse, here, Ruth 1:20, she said to them, do not call me Naomi, call me Mara, which means bitter. For the Almighty has dealt very bitterly with me.
Can I make a comment just for Steve? You'll notice that the name is changed here. And so some of that, like Malin, we don't know. Saul's name was changed to Paul. There's Abram's name was changed to Abraham. There's a lot of that goes on in the Israel culture. We don't know if Malin's original birth name was Malin. It could possibly have been somewhere along the line. He was a limp, skinny guy, and that's the name that was changed. Does that make sense?
A lot of identity theft.
Yeah.
But that was very common.
It was common for them to go through that. You're absolutely right. That's exactly right. So Naomi thinks the hand of the Lord is against her. Okay? That's what she's thinking about. She does hear in Ruth chapter 1, verse 6, she does hear, though, she's working out in the fields of Moab, or she's out in the fields of Moab, that the Lord had basically taken away the famine in Bethlehem. And so she gets this idea, okay, that's good news. I'm going to go back to Bethlehem. Okay? And so then she sets in motion these events that's where she's going to go. So she's telling her daughter-in-laws, okay, goodbye. I'm going to head back to Bethlehem. And that's when Ruth says, no, where you go, I'm going to go. Okay? Her other daughter-in-law says, okay, I'm going to leave. I'm going to go back to the Moabites. So Naomi has some amount of smarts. Okay? She also recognizes that the Lord was bringing some amount of goodness, not only just providing back into her hometown of Bethlehem, but the kindness that Naomi showed to her. and also the kindness of Boaz. Okay, and that's our third character. So we have Ruth, we have Naomi, and we have Boaz. Okay, and Boaz here, he's a wealthy landowner. He lives in Bethlehem. He owns a lot of land. He's a worthy man. He was related to Naomi's husband. His name means quickness or swiftness. Okay? I like these play on names. He was also God-fearing type of man. So he looked for and he desired God's blessing, not only to be given to him, but to be given to others. That's what you're going to see. And in chapter 2, he extends grace to Ruth. Grace far beyond what a person of Ruth's stature would normally receive. Okay? So Ruth is a poor person coming with Naomi, coming back to Bethlehem. She doesn't have a lot. And so here Boaz is a big landowner, and it was during the time of the harvest, and harvesting's going on, and these harvesters are called reapers. They're reaping. And in the law, in Leviticus chapter 19, we have a verse, 19 verse 9 and 10. It says, the law said, when you reap the harvest of your land, Boaz knows this, you shall not reap your field right up to the edge. In other words, leave the corners there, okay? And neither shall you gather the gleanings from your harvest, the things that have fallen on the ground, leave them there. So you only the gatherings in your hand take with you, okay? And leave the rest there. And you shall not strip your vineyard bare, neither shall you gather the fallen grapes from your vineyard. You shall leave them for the poor and for the sojourner. I am the Lord your God. And so we have Ruth meeting both those requirements. So he's a sojourner and a poor. And so here it's almost as if this law was meant for Ruth, specifically. Yeah. And so she ends up gleaning in Boaz's field. Okay? Not by chance, not by just circumstances. She's there. And Boaz ends up meeting her, and he willingly becomes a redeemer for Ruth. Because it says in Ruth 3:12, it says, Boaz talking to Ruth, and now it is true that I am a redeemer. Okay? And so this idea of a kinsman redeemer comes into play. And that idea of kinsman redeemer is a person coming to help or to rescue another. Okay? To give protection of sorts. And so the goal of the Hebrews here for this kinsman redeemer was for the nearest blood relative who was alive to be the redeemer. Okay? To somebody who needed the help, whether that they needed the help in terms of somebody dying, or who died, or was poor, or whatever the circumstances, and so through poverty, whatever it is, to redeem their property. Okay, and so Naomi and her husband had property in Bethlehem. Okay, before they left for Moab. And they couldn't take their property and transfer it to Moab. Okay? Can't do that. They left Bethlehem to go to Moab to live. Famine in Bethlehem, right? Their property was still there. Her husband dies. She comes back. Okay? Somebody else has that property. And so the kinsmen, the relatives, step up to take that property back for them, to redeem it. Do you get the picture? Okay? And Boaz is the one who acted as that kinsman redeemer. Okay? And he's the guy who does all that. And there is some amount of these themes here. I call them mega themes. The initial purpose of the book is really kind of stated at the very end of chapter 4. And that was to trace the ancestry, back to David the king, okay? And ultimately that traces it to Christ the king, okay? And so But beyond there, there's a lot of spiritual truth here found in this story, and there's these mega themes. And this first one I wanted to go through, there's 4 particular ones I want to talk about. There's others, but these are big ones, and that's faithfulness. Okay, so this story Ruth talks about, Ruth was not only a faithful wife, she's a faithful daughter-in-law, and she's faithful to God. She's all this. She serves the Lord, and she does all the things. And there's a verse, a couple verses in the Old Testament that describe this that I have down here, and this is Joshua 24:14 and 15. Joshua is speaking to the Israelites. He says, "Now therefore fear the Lord. Serve him in sincerity and faithfulness. Put away the gods that your fathers served beyond the river in Egypt, and serve the Lord. And if it is evil in your eyes to serve the Lord, choose this day whom you will serve, whether the gods your fathers served in the region beyond the river, or the gods of the Amorites in whose land you dwell. But as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord." And that's Ruth's response. That was her response to Naomi, and continues on even as her response to Boaz. Okay, and because that Ruth chapter 1 verse 16, that theme verse, your people shall be my people, your God shall be my God. So that's her response in terms of being faithful to that. That's the first mega theme that we're going to see. The second one is loving kindness. Okay, and so this loving kindness that Ruth had dealt kindly to Naomi. In other words, she didn't abandon her like the other daughter-in-law. She dealt kindly with it, and as a result, Boaz dealt kindly with Ruth. And then Ruth brought those gleanings back to Naomi. Okay, so we see this loving kindness happen over and over again, and we recognize it. In Ruth chapter 1 verse 8, Naomi said to her 2 daughters-in-law, "Go, return each of them to his house. May the Lord deal kindly with you as you have dealt with the dead with me." In other words, with my sons, you've dealt kindly with me. Okay? And then Boaz says the same thing in chapter 3. "May you be blessed by the Lord, my daughter. You've made this last kindness greater than the first." So they're recognizing this loving kindness. And so corresponding verses in Proverbs chapter 21, "Whoever pursues righteousness and kindness will find life, righteousness, and honor." And that's what Ruth was doing. She was pursuing righteousness and kindness. And so this comes out just as a big thing. Okay? Ladies, you'll like this. Woman of valor. Okay? Right? That's what Ruth was. Or another way to say it, she was a worthy woman. Maybe a better way to say it. Okay? Even though Ruth didn't know what was going to happen to her, she didn't know. She was viewed as this worthy woman. In chapter 3, verse 11, Boaz says to her, "And now, my daughter, do not fear. I will do for you all that you ask. For all my fellow townsmen know that you are a worthy woman." So Boaz is stating this for us so that we know. In Proverbs 31:10 says this. It's speaks of a worthy woman. It says, "An excellent wife, who can find? She is far more precious than jewels." Absolutely true. And this was Ruth. The last one we want to hit on is this idea of kinsman redeemer. And so this idea is the male relative would redeem. We'd already talked about this, and there's a verse in Deuteronomy that talks about redeeming, okay, in Deuteronomy 25. But Boaz acted as this kinsman redeemer for Ruth, and ultimately it benefited Naomi too. But this is just a huge one because it has these ramifications for us in terms of who Christ is, and that's another one that we're going to be talking about. So I would just challenge you to keep in mind these mega themes as we go through Ruth. Okay, each one of them is going to be presented. This story of this Gentile woman married to a Jew and became part of salvation history. You know, that's what happened here. She becomes part of this salvation history. But along the way, we've got these incredible practical lessons to learn, you know, and I'm kind of excited about it. So we have several weeks of Ruth. Next week we'll be on chapter 1. The following week we'll be on chapter 2. And so 3 weeks from now, we're going to actually have a special mystery guest speaker coming in.
Who is it?
Now, I can't tell you. I'm not going to tell you. That's coming up on August 19th. So I just encourage you to come back to hear the whole story of Ruth as these chapters, as they unfold, and this mystery speaker and that sort of thing. So I'd encourage you to come back.